emphasis. And so we ask ourselves that question, what's the purpose of this parable? Why did Jesus teach this parable? Number 5, be very careful not to press the language of the parable beyond its intended design and meaning. Sometimes we can do that if we're not careful. When you get into Luke 18, the unrighteous judge and the widow, well, if we ever think that our Heavenly Father is like that unrighteous judge. Remember, the widow kept coming back and kept coming back. Jesus is using that parable to teach, once again, persistency in prayer. You keep going in prayer. But if we ever think, well, we have to keep going because our Heavenly Father is like the unrighteous judge. Remember what the judge said? I'm going to give her her request, lest by her continually coming she wear me out. That's not my God's attitude. That's not your God's attitude. He wants us to come boldly before His throne of grace. Hebrews 4 and verse 16. And so we can press a parable too far. And so be very careful of that. Look at number 6. What happened to 6? Boy, I can't count. We went from 5 to 7. Okay. Tyler, did you have access to my thumb drive before this started? Okay. Consider any special emphasis or literary devices. Think about this. There are many parables that employ what is referred to as a triad, emphasizing 3 things. The Good Samaritan, the whole parable is surrounding the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. A triad, if you will. Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. Remember the 10 virgins, 5 foolish virgins, 5 wise virgins, and the bridegroom. So many of them follow this, a triad. Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son. There is the prodigal son, there is the older brother, and there is the father. And so we see it over and over and over. We're not saying all of them do that, but in many of them that device is used. It helps us to recall it. And then also remember what has been called the end point. Typically the beginning of the parable is not where Jesus is laying the emphasis, where He's laying the stress. It's at the end of the parable. That's where He drives the point home. The Good Samaritan, go and do likewise. That's the stress of that parable. Go and do likewise. You live, and to the Jews, remember, you go and live like this Samaritan. They had to gall them because it was the Good Samaritan. It wasn't their priest and Levite that helped. It was the Good Samaritan. Now you go and do likewise. You live like he lived. Well, they didn't like that a bit. Again, the end result of these parables, so important. Remember, one thing I like to emphasize in Luke 12, in verse 21, the end of the rich farmer, he says, so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. That's the stress. He's saying, in essence, don't just come down hard on this rich farmer, the one that I built the parable upon. He says, so is he, and the emphasis is based upon the parable, so is he a fool, anybody else, who lays up treasure for themselves and is not rich towards God. So as you get into those parables and read and reread, put an emphasis on that end stress, because that's really the point that Jesus is coming to, okay? Now, next week we'll go ahead and we'll start in some parables. And because we don't really have any suggestions as of yet, we'll begin with Matthew 13 and verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid. For joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and purchases that field. We'll just look at that one verse parable. Matthew 13 and verse 44. Thank you so much for your attention tonight, for your comments.